Welcome, everyone. The Mind, Brain, and Behavior Interfaculty Initiative is a university-wide community that studies the structure, function, evolution, development, and pathology of the nervous system in relation to decision-making and behavior. MBB is our host today for this exciting conversation on the science of gender and science. Our conversation will be led by Steve Pinker, the Johnstone Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard, and Elizabeth Spelke, the Berkman Professor of Psychology at Harvard and the co-director of MBB. My name is David Leibson. I'm a professor of economics at Harvard, and I will serve as the moderator. Professors Pinker and Spelke will start this event by making half-hour presentations without interruption from each other or the audience. Professors Pinker and Spelke will then have a chance to respond to each other's presentations in a rather unstructured way. Then I will solicit questions from the floor. I ask that audience members state their questions with maximal brevity, please, so we can hear from as many of you as possible. We'll wrap things up no later than 6 p.m. Let's get started. By mutual agreement, Professor Pinker will make the first presentation. Steve?
Thank you very much. Thanks, David, for moderating it. Thanks, Liz, for agreeing to this conversation. Can you hear me in the back? No. How's this? This better? Okay. Maybe I should use this one instead then. Is that better? Okay. It's a privilege to be engaged in a conversation with my colleague Elizabeth Spelke. We go back a long way. We've been colleagues both at MIT, where I helped attract her, and at Harvard, where she helped attract me. Like most people in my field, I have enormous admiration for Liz's brilliant contributions to our understanding of the origins of cognition. But we do find ourselves with somewhat different perspectives on a recent issue. And for those of you who've just arrived from Mars, there's been a certain amount of discussion here at Harvard on a particular datum. And that is the underrepresentation of women among tenure-track faculty in elite universities in physical science, math, and engineering. And here are some recent figures. Now, as with many issues in psychology, there are three broad classes of explanations. One can imagine an extreme nature position that males but not females have the talents and temperaments necessary for science. Needless to say, only a madman could believe that, and there aren't any proponents of that position. There's an extreme nurture position that males and females are biologically indistinguishable, and all the relevant sex differences are products of socialization and bias. And then there's an intermediate position that the difference is explainable by some combination of biological differences in average temperaments and talents interacting with socialization and bias. Well, Liz has embraced the extreme nurture position, ironically enough, because standardly in cognitive science, she and I are always put in the same camp as the innatists when it comes to explaining the mind. But Liz has said that there is not a shred of evidence for the biological factor, that the case against there being a male advantage is so overwhelming that it is hard to see how one can make a case for it on the other side, and that this is as conclusive as any finding that I know of in science. Well, we certainly aren't facing the stereotypical gender difference in confidence here. Now, I'm a controversial guy. I've taken a lot of controversial positions over the years, and as a member of Homo sapiens, I think I'm right on all of them. But on the other hand, I don't think that in any of them I would say that there's not a shred of evidence for the other side, that even if I think the evidence favors one side, I would not say that the other side can't even make a case, even if I think that their case is not as good as the opposite. And as conclusive as any finding in science, I mean, this is social science. This would imply that the extreme nurture position is more convincing than, say, the evidence that the sun is at the center of the solar system, or the laws of thermodynamics, theory of evolution, plate tectonics, and so on. I think these are rather extreme statements. especially in light of the fact that there is an enormous amount of work summarized in these and many other literature reviews that, in fact, come to a very different conclusion. And I'll cite from one of them, a book called Sex Differences in Cognitive Abilities by Diane Halpern, a respected psychologist, recently elected president of the APA, and someone with no theoretical axe to grind, certainly does not subscribe to any particular theory, and has been a critic, for example, of evolutionary psychology. And here's what she wrote in the preface to her book. At the time I started writing this book, it seemed clear to me that any between-sex differences in thinking abilities were due to socialization practices, artifacts, and mistakes in the research. After reviewing a pile of journal articles that stood several feet high and numerous books and book chapters that dwarfed the stack of journal articles, I changed my mind. The literature on sex differences in cognitive abilities is filled with inconsistent findings, contradictory theories, and emotional claims that are unsupported by the research. Yet despite all the noise in the data, clear and consistent messages could be heard. There are real and in some cases sizable sex differences with respect to some cognitive abilities. Socialization practices are undoubtedly important, but there is also good evidence that biological sex differences play a role in establishing and maintaining cognitive sex differences, a conclusion I wasn't prepared to make when I began reviewing the relevant literature. This captures my assessment perfectly. Now, again, for the benefit of the Martians in this room, this isn't just any old issue in empirical psychology, and there are some political colorings to it, and so I want to begin with just a confession of my own politics. That is, I am a feminist. I believe that women have been oppressed and discriminated against and harassed for thousands of years. I believe that the two waves of the feminist movement in the 20th century are among the proudest achievements in our species. I'm happy to have lived through one of them, and including the effort to increase representation of women in the sciences. But in order to endorse this claim, I think it's crucial to distinguish between the moral proposition that people should not be discriminated against on account of their sex, which I take to be the core of feminism, and the empirical claim that males and females are biologically indistinguishable. These are not the same thing. Indeed, distinguishing them, I think, is essential to protecting the core of feminism, since anyone who takes an honest interest in science has to be prepared for the facts to come out either way. It's essential that we don't hold the ideals of feminism hostage to the latest findings that come out of the lab or field, which would only result in, if they came out one way, saying that I guess sex discrimination wasn't so bad after all, or else in furiously spin-doctoring the scientific results to preserve the political principle. The truth cannot be sexist, and whatever the facts turn out to be, I don't think they compromise the core of feminism. Well, why study sex differences? Believe me, being the Bobby Riggs of cognitive science is not my idea of a good time. Why study them? It's not the focus of my own research, but on the other hand, as a curious person, the difference between the sexes is part of the human condition. We all have a mother and a father. Most of us are attracted to members of the opposite sex, and the rest of us notice the difference from those who do. And we can't help but notice the sex of our children, friends, and colleagues in every walk of life. Also, the topic of sex differences is of great scientific interest. It's a fundamental problem in biology because sex goes back probably a billion years, sex differences. There's an interesting theory, which I won't have time to get into, that predicts that there should be an overall and equal investment of organisms in males and females. Neither sex is predicted to be superior or inferior, but also an elegant theory, Bob Triver's theory of differential minimum parental investment, that makes some highly specific predictions about when you should expect differences. Also, it's of practical importance. I think there are aspects of the world that we want to change, but if we want to change the world, we must first understand it, and that includes understanding the sources of sex differences. So let me get back to the datum to be explained. In many ways, this is a very exotic phenomenon. It involves biologically unprepared talents and temperaments. Evolution certainly did not shape any part of the mind in order to be a professor of mechanical engineering at MIT, for example. And so the datum has nothing to do with basic cognitive processes, or those that we use in our everyday lives, in school, or even in most college courses, where indeed there are few sex differences. So this datum is not about that kind of performance. We're also talking about extremes of achievement. Most women are not qualified to be math professors at Harvard because most men aren't qualified to be math professors at Harvard. We are talking about extremes in the population. We're talking about a subset of fields, that it is not the case that women are underrepresented to that extent in all academic fields, and certainly not in all prestigious professions. And also we're talking about a statistical effect. This is such a crucial point that I want to discuss it in some detail. Women are nowhere near absent, even from the fields in which they are underrepresented. And the explanations for the differences must be statistical as well. And here is just a touchstone for this entire discussion. These are two Gaussian or normal distributions, bell curves, where this is anything that you want to measure. The x-axis, the y-axis is the proportion of people at that ability. This is what it typically looks like when you compare the sexes on any measure in which they differ. Namely, for this example, if we say that this is the male curve and this is the female curve, the means may be different, but at any particular level of the variable, there are always representatives of both genders. So right away, a number of statements that have been made in the events of the last couple of months are simply red herrings that should not have been made by people who understand this, such as the accusation that, for example, President Summers implied that 50% of the brightest minds in America do not have the right aptitude for science, that women just can't cut it, and so on. These are statistically illiterate and have nothing to do with what we're actually discussing. Now, an important corollary of two overlapping normal distributions, one of them is that the normal distribution falls off according to the negative exponential of the square of the difference from the mean. And that means that even with small differences in the means of two distributions, the more extreme the score, the greater the disparity in the numbers. That is, the ratios get more extreme as you go farther out along the tail. If we hold a magnifying glass up to the tails of the distribution, even though they overlap over the bulk of the curve, when you get out to the extremes, the difference between the two curves gets larger and larger. Which means, to give you an example, we know that the distribution of height between men and women overlap. It's not the case that all men are taller than all women. And at 5'10", there are 30 men for every woman, whereas at 6 feet, there are 2,000 men for every woman. Now, the sex differences in cognition tend not to be anything like that, but that's just to reinforce the statistical point. Another important corollary is that tail ratios are affected by differences in variance. And biologists since Darwin have noted that for many traits and many species, males are the more variable gender. So even in cases where the mean for, say, women and the mean for men is the same, the fact that there are more men dispersed at the extremes means that at the tails, the proportion of men would be higher at one tail and higher at the other. As it's sometimes summarized, that more prodigies, more idiots. So let me begin with the first point in connecting the political issue to the scientific issue, and that is that as economists who study patterns of discrimination have long argued, often to no avail, there's a crucial conceptual difference between a difference and discrimination. That a departure from a 50-50 ratio in any profession does not by itself imply discrimination unless the interests and aptitudes are statistically equated. And let me just illustrate that with an example, and I'll use myself. I am in a field that is, in fact, dominated by women. 75% of the main professional association in the study of child language is female, as are majority of the keynote speakers at our main conference. I'm here to tell you that it's not because I was discriminated against. I decided to study language development as opposed to, say, mechanical engineering. For many reasons. I don't think that designing a better automobile transmission would turn me on as much as figuring out how kids acquire language. And I don't think I'd be as good at it as I am at studying child language. Now, all we need to do in order to explain differences without presumably getting anyone upset about possible sexist interpretation, is to ask whether whatever traits that I have that give me that predisposition are exactly equally distributed statistically among men and among women. For all those of you out there who also are not mechanical engineers, then you should understand what I'm talking about, of both genders. Okay, there are many similarities between the sexes. There are no differences in general intelligence or G. They are exactly the same on the money. Basic categories of cognition, how we negotiate our world and live our everyday life, our concept of objects, number, people, living things, and so on, show no differences. And indeed, in cases where there are differences, there's pretty much as many instances in which men do slightly better than women as in which women do slightly better than men. Just to give you a few examples, men are better at throwing, women are more dexterous. Men are better at mentally rotating shapes, women are better at visual memory. Men are better at problem solving, women are better at mathematical calculation, and on and on and on. But there are 6 differences that are relevant to this datum. The literature on this is so enormous that I can only touch a fraction of it, and I'll restrict myself to a few cases where there are enormous data sets or meta-analyses that try to boil down the literature. The first difference, long noted by economists studying employment patterns, is that men and women differ in what they state are their own priorities in life. That, to sum it up, men on average are more likely to chase status at the expense of family. Women give a different weighting. Now, again, think statistics. It doesn't mean that women value family and not status. It doesn't mean that men value status and not family, nor does it mean that every last woman or every last man has this asymmetry. But in large data sets, on average, that's what you find. And just one example of this is in the study of mathematically precocious youth. In this case, 1,729 people who were selected in 7th grade for being in the top 1% of ability in mathematics. These are men and women who are, and then followed up decades later. They are certainly equally talented. If anyone has ever been encouraged at math and science, these kids were, both genders. They are equal in terms of their levels of achievement, and they report being equally satisfied with the course of their lives. Nonetheless, there are a number of statistical differences in what they say is important to them. There are a number of cases in which females rate things higher than males, such as the ability to have a part-time career for a limited time in one's life, living close to parents and relatives, having a meaningful spiritual life, having strong friendships. For the traits that men rate as higher than women on average, they include having lots of money, inventing or creating something, having a full-time career, being successful in my line of work. And it's worth noting that studies of highly successful people note that single-mindedness and competitiveness is a recurring trait in geniuses of both sexes. Here's just one other figure from this data set. As you might expect, this sample has a lot of people who like to work Herculean hours, a lot of people who like to work 50, 60, even 70 hours a week, but there are slight differences at each one of these ranges. There's slightly more men than women who don't care whether or not they have a life. Second, people versus things and abstract rule systems. There is a staggering amount of data on this because there's a whole field of psychology and economics that studies people's vocational interests. I bet most people in this room have taken one of those tests at some point in their lives. And there are consistent differences in the kinds of things that appeal to men and women in their ideal job. I'll just discuss one of them, which is a desire to work with people versus things, where there is that is a one standard deviation in terms of men over women. And indeed, this will tend to cause people to gravitate in slightly different directions. For the occupation that's strongest at the people end of this continuum is a director of a community services organization. The occupations that are strongest at the things end are physicist, chemist, mathematician, computer programmer, and biologist. And you see this not only in choice of whether to go into science, but also in which branch of science the sexes go into. Needless to say, from 1970 to 2002, there's been a huge increase in the percentage of degrees awarded to women. But among the PhDs, for example, you find a difference. We'll take the year 2001, that in education, 65% of the doctorates go to women, 54% of social science degrees, 47% of life science, 26% of physical science, 17% of engineering, which is perfectly predictable by the continuum between people and living things and inanimate objects. And this is pretty much the same in 1980 and 2001, despite changes in absolute numbers. Third, risk. Men are by far the more reckless sex. In a large meta-analysis involving 150 studies and 100,000 participants, in 14 out of 16 categories of risk-taking, men were overrepresented. The two sexes were equal on the other two, one of which was smoking for obvious reasons. And two of the largest sex differences were in intellectual risk-taking and participation in a risky experiment. And I think it's because of this that in everyday life, we do see such a difference. Men are very much overrepresented in the following category, namely the Darwin Awards, commemorating those individuals who ensure the long-term survival of our species by removing themselves from the gene pool in a sublimely idiotic fashion, in which I think virtually all, perhaps all of the winners are men. Fourth, three-dimensional mental transformations, the ability to determine whether each of these pairs of objects represents the same three-dimensional shape. Again, I'll appeal to a meta-analysis, 286 data sets, 100,000 subjects, and the authors say we have specified a number of tests that show highly significant sex differences that are stable across age, at least after puberty, and have not decreased in recent years. In this case, the test, the advantage goes to the men, although, as I mentioned, the advantage goes to women in other kinds of spatial ability. But in mental rotation, spatial perception, and spatial visualization, there are sex differences tipping in the male direction. Now, does this have any relevance to scientific achievement? Well, we don't really know for sure, but there's some reason to think that it is, that three-dimensional spatial visualization is correlated with mathematical problem solving, and it figures prominently in the memoirs and introspections of most creative physicists and chemists, including Faraday, Maxwell, Tesla, Kekulé, and Lorentz, all of whom claim to have hit upon their discoveries by dynamic visual imagery and only later set them down in equations. A typical quote is as follows: "The psychical entities which seem to serve as elements in my thought are certain signs and more or less clear images which can be voluntarily reproduced and combined. This combinatory play seems to be the essential feature in productive thought before there is any connection with logical construction in words or other kinds of signs." And that is a quote from a fairly well-known scientist. Mathematical reasoning. Girls and women get better school grades in mathematics and pretty much everything else these days. And women are better at mathematical calculation. But consistently, men score, at least statistically, better on mathematical word problems and on tests of mathematical reasoning. Again, a meta-analysis, 254 data sets, 3 million subjects, shows no significant difference in childhood. This is a difference that emerges around puberty, but there are sizable differences in adolescence and adulthood, especially in high-end samples. Here's an example of the SAT mathematical score, where there's about a 40-point difference in favor of men. That's pretty much consistent from 1972 to 1997. In the study of mathematically precocious youth, in which 7th graders were given the SAT, which of course ordinarily is administered only to college-bound kids who are much older, the ratio of those scoring over 700 is 2.8 to 1, male to female. And admittedly and interestingly, that's down from 25 years ago when it was a 13 to 1 ratio. And perhaps we can discuss some of the reasons. At the 760 cutoff, the ratio nowadays is 7 to 1, male to female. Now, why is there a discrepancy with grades? Do SATs and other tests of mathematical reasoning underpredict grades, or do grades overpredict high-end aptitude? At the Radcliffe Forum, Liz was very explicit in which side she takes, saying that the tests are no good, unquote. Well, one question is, why does every major graduate program, including MIT and Harvard, the very departments where Liz and I selected our graduate students by looking at GRE scores, still use them if they are so useless? And I think the reason is that compared to school grades, in which which often are affected by homework, by solving the kind of problems that have already been presented in lecture and textbooks, the aptitude tests are designed to test the application of mathematical knowledge to unfamiliar problems, which is, of course, the way that math is used in actually doing math and science. And in fact, I think contrary to popular opinion of Liz and many intellectuals, the tests are very good. There's an enormous amount of data on the predictive power of SAT tests. Among people in science careers, they overwhelmingly score in the 90th percentile in the SAT or GRE math. And they predict earnings, occupational choice, doctoral degrees, the prestige of one's degree, the probability of having a tenure-track position, and number of patents. Moreover, this predictive power is the same for men and women. As for why there is that slight underprediction, 1/10 of a standard deviation in undergraduate grades, the College Board did do a study on that, and they were able to explain it by a combination of the choice of major, which differs among sexes, and the greater conscientiousness of women, solving that mystery. Finally, there's variability. Here it's crucial to, because estimates of variance depend on the tails of the distribution, which by definition are less numerous, and since people at the tails are likely to be weeded out of many surveys for various reasons, it's important to have large representative samples from national populations. And for this, the gold standard is the science paper by Novell and Hedges with 6 large stratified probability samples, in which they found that in 35 out of 37 tests, including all of the ones in math, space, and science, the male variance was greater than the female variance. One other gold standard data set is this graph of where the entire population of Scotland was given an intelligence test. What we have here, this is IQ, where the mean is 100, and this is the proportion of men and the proportion of women. And as you can see, there's a very orderly finding. In the middle part of the range, females predominate. At both extremes, males slightly predominate. Needless to say, there's a large percentage of women at both ends as well, but there is also a sex difference. Now, the fact that these differences exist does not mean that they are innate. And this, of course, is a much more difficult question to answer. A prelude is that nature and nurture are not alternatives. It is possible that the answer involves some of each. But I think that there are 10 kinds of evidence that at least suggest that the contribution of biology is greater than 0, though it is certainly nowhere near 100%. First is that there are lots of biological mechanisms by which a sex difference could occur. There are large differences in sex hormones in men and women, especially prenatally in the first 6 months of life and in adolescence after puberty. There are receptors for hormones all over the brain, including the cerebral cortex. There are many small differences that have been noted in men's and women's brains, including the overall size of the brain, even correcting for body size, and the density of cortical neurons, cortical asymmetry, hypothalamic nuclei, and a number of others. Many sex differences, certainly some, maybe all, are universal. The idea that there are cultures out there somewhere in which everything is the reverse of here turns out to be a myth. In Human Universals, the anthropologist Donald Brown, surveying this literature, points out that in all cultures, men and women are seen as having different natures, that there's a greater involvement of women in direct childcare, more competitiveness in various measures for men than women, and a greater spatial range of men compared to women. In personality, there was at least a cross-national sample. In Feingold's meta-analysis, he noted gender differences in personality that are consistent across ages, years of data collection, educational levels, and nations. In terms of spatial and math abilities, I think we have less data. And the honest answer is that we don't have true cross-cultural surveys, although we do have cross-national surveys. David Geary and Catherine DeSoto found the expected sex difference in mental rotation in 10 European countries, Ghana, Turkey, and China. And Diane Halpern, analyzing results from 10 countries, said that the majority of the findings show amazing cross-cultural consistency when comparing males and females on cognitive tests. Stability over time. In life interests and personality, there's been little or no change despite 2 generations of second wave of feminism. There is also famously resistance to change in communities that for various ideological reasons were dedicated to stamping out sex differences and found that they were unable to do so. These include the Israeli kibbutz, various rural American utopian communities of the end of the 19th century, and contemporary androgynous academic couples. In mental rotation, the meta-analysis by Voyer et al. Found no change over time. In mathematical reasoning, there has been a decline in the difference, although it has certainly not disappeared. Fourth, many of these differences can be seen in other mammals, suggesting that it's unlikely that the difference was arbitrarily replicated in humans. There is a big difference in many mammals between males and females in aggression, in investment in offspring, in aggressive play versus play parenting, in the range size and also the spatial ability, such as solving mazes, at least in polygynous species, as humans are, and even in a number of primate species, an interest in physical objects versus conspecifics, as seen in patterns of juvenile play. Even baby vervet monkeys the males prefer to play with trucks and the females with other toys. Many of these emerge in early childhood. In the literature, it's said that there is a technical term for people who believe that boys and girls are indistinguishable and are molded into their different natures by parental socialization. The term for such people is childless. Some differences seem to emerge even in the first week of life. Girls respond more to sounds of distress. Girls make more eye contact. And in a study that I know that Liz disputes that I hope we'll talk about, there's one study claiming that newborns, the boys are more interested in physical objects, the girls in people, or at least in a face. A little later, there are vast and robust sex differences all over the world. Boys, far more often than girls, engage in rough and tumble play involving aggression, physical activity, and competition. Girls more often in cooperative play. Girls engage much more often in play parenting. And yes, it really is true that boys will turn anything into a vehicle or a weapon, and girls will turn things into dolls. There are differences in intuitive psychology, how well kids can read one another's minds. There are a number of documentations of a sex difference in solving the false belief task and in interpreting the mental states of characters in stories in favor of girls. Sixth, genetic boys brought up as girls. They're in a famous case, sometimes called the John Joan case. One member of a pair of identical twin boys lost his penis in a botched circumcision. I was relieved to find that this was not done by a mohel, but by a bungling surgeon. Under advice from the gender psychologists of the time, the parents agreed to have the boy castrated, given female-specific hormones, and brought up as a girl. This was hidden from him until he was 14. When I was an undergraduate, this case was taught to me as an instance of how gender roles are completely socially acquired. But it turned out that the facts had been suppressed, and when this boy was revisited, it turned out that right from the earliest ages, he exhibited male-specific patterns, aggression and rough and tumble play, exactly characteristic of boys, a greater interest in things than people. At the age of 14, suffering from depression, his father finally told him the truth. He underwent further surgery, married a woman, adopted some children, and got a job in a slaughterhouse. Now, this is not just a single instance. In a condition called cloacal exstrophy, genetic boys are sometimes born without normal male genitalia, and when they have been, again, castrated and brought up as girls, in 25 out of 25 documented instances, they felt that they were boys trapped in girls' bodies and showed male-specific patterns of rough and tumble play and so on. 7, lack of differential treatment by parents and teachers. These two findings surprise a lot of people. One is that if you, Litton and Romney did a meta-analysis of sex-specific socialization involving 172 studies, 28,000 children, looking at both reports and direct observations of how parents treat their sons and daughters, and found few or no differences among contemporary Americans. And in particular, there was no difference in the two categories of encouraging achievement and encouraging achievement in mathematics. Also, there's a widespread myth that teachers who of course are still disproportionately female, are actually dupes in perpetuating gender inequities, in failing to call on girls and otherwise having low expectations of their performance. In fact, Jussum and Eccles, in a study of 100 teachers and 1,800 students, concluded that teachers seem to be basing their perceptions of students on those students' actual performance and motivation. Studies of prenatal sex hormones, the mechanism that makes boys boys and girls girls in the first place. There is some evidence, although admittedly squishy in parts, that this makes a difference even within a social gender. In the condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, girls in utero are subjected to an increased dose of androgens, later nullified postnatally, but when they grow up, they have male-typical toy preferences compared to other girls in terms of trucks and guns, male-typical play patterns, more competitive, less cooperative, male-typical occupational preferences. However, the research on their spatial abilities is inconclusive, and I will not be willing to say that there's been a good demonstration that they have male-typical patterns of spatial cognition. Similarly, variations in fetal testosterone, studied in various ways, show that fetal testosterone has a curvilinear relationship to reduced eye contact and face perception at 12 months, reduced vocabulary at 18 months, reduced social skills and greater narrowness of interest at 48 months, and enhanced mental rotation in the school-age years. Circulating sex hormones, I'm going to go over this slide pretty quickly because I think the literature is a bit of a mess. It's possible that all of it is bogus. I suspect that there is something to be salvaged from this somewhat contradictory literature, but I will admit that it does not present a perfectly clear picture. Nonetheless, there are many studies showing that a normal to low male range of testosterone is associated with better spatial abilities in a variety of ways in which hormones are compared or manipulated, and some evidence disputed that there are statistical changes in the strengths and weaknesses in cognition of women during the menstrual cycle, paralleling the changes in men during the daily and seasonal cycles. The last bit of evidence is on imprinted X chromosomes, that it turns out it's been discovered that there's an entirely separate genetic system capable of implementing sex differences in a variety of animals that David Haig here has studied. In the condition called Turner syndrome, a child has just one X chromosome but can get it either from her mother or her father. When she inherits an X that is specific to girls, she is on average better at reading emotions, at body language, at reading faces, better vocabulary, and better social skills. Just one note on stereotypes, and then I'll end. Are these stereotypes? Well, many of them are, although I must say not all, such as female abilities in spatial memory, mathematical calculation, and so on. There seems to be a widespread assumption in much of this discussion that if there is a stereotype, that explains a difference as being the cause of differential expectations. But of course, the causal arrow could go in either direction. Stereotypes might reflect differences, and in fact, there's an enormous literature in cognitive psychology that says that people are good intuitive statisticians and that their prototypes and conceptual categories track the statistics of the natural world pretty well. And that is, just as an example, we do have a stereotype that basketball players are taller on average than jockeys, but certainly doesn't mean that our stereotypes cause that difference in height. Likewise, Alice Eagley and Jessamine Eccles have shown that most of people's gender stereotypes are in fact pretty accurate. Indeed, the error is in the direction of underpredicting sex differences. So to sum up, I think there's more than a shred of evidence for sex differences that are relevant to statistical gender disparities in elite science departments. There are reliable average differences in life priorities, interest in people versus things, risk-seeking, spatial transformations, and mathematical reasoning, and variability in these traits. There are 10 kinds of evidence that suggest that the differences are not completely explained by socialization and bias, although they surely are in part. And just to give a couple of concluding thoughts, none of this, I think, provides any grounds for ignoring the biases and barriers that keep women out of science, as long as we keep in mind the distinction between fairness on the one hand and sameness on the other. They are different things. I'll give the final word to Gloria Steinem, who said that there are very few jobs that actually require a penis or a vagina, and all the other jobs should be open to both sexes. Thank you very much.
How's that? Yes. Okay, good. Thanks to David. Thanks especially to Steve. I'm really glad we're able to have this debate. Been looking forward to it. Here's the first slide. I wanted to start by talking about some points of agreement between Steve and me. And as he suggested in the introduction, there's actually many. I think if we got away from the topic of sex and science, we'd be hard-pressed to find issues that we disagree on. This is not working. I better stay here. But here are a few of the points of agreement that I think are particularly relevant to the discussions that have been going around over the last few months. First of all, we agree that both our society in general and our universities in particular are going to be healthiest if all opinions can be put on the table and debated on their merits. We also agree that claims concerning sex differences are empirical. They should be evaluated by evidence, and we'll all be a lot happier and live a lot longer if we can try to undertake that evaluation as dispassionately and rationally as possible. We agree that the mind is not a blank slate. In fact, probably one of the deepest things that Steve and I agree on is that there is such a thing as human nature, and it can be a fabulously fascinating and exhilarating experience to ask what our human nature is like. And finally, I think we agree that the role of scientists in society is actually a rather humble one. What scientists do is try to find things out. The much more difficult questions of deciding how to use that information, how to live our lives, how to structure our societies, those are not questions that scientists can answer. Those are questions that everybody needs to participate in. So what do we disagree on? We disagree on the answer to the question, why in the world is it that women are as scarce as hen's teeth on Harvard's mathematics faculty and other similar institutions? Now, in the debate that's been going around, two classes of factors have been appealed to account for this difference. One class are social forces, including overt and covert discrimination and other social forces that shape men and women to be capable of different things, develop different skills, develop different priorities. And the other class of factors are genetic in nature, genetic differences between men and women that lead men and women to have different capacities and to want different things. Now, in his book, The Blank Slate, and again today, Steve argued that social forces are very overrated as causes of gender differences. Discrimination used to be a big deal. It's much less of a big deal now. Differential treatment, I don't need to repeat his talk to you. Intrinsic differences in aptitude are a larger factor, and intrinsic differences in motives, you didn't really order these, but I think you would say it's the biggest factor of all. Certainly all the examples, most of the examples that Steve gave with the strongest evidence concerned what he takes to be biologically based differences in motives. Now, my own view is somewhat different. I think the big culprits here, the big forces causing this gap are indeed those social factors. I think there are no differences. I'll make all those radical statements Steve attributed to me. There are no differences in overall intrinsic aptitude for science and mathematics among women and men. Notice what this is not saying. It is not saying the genders are indistinguishable. It's not saying men and women are alike in every way. It's not even saying that men and women have identical cognitive profiles. What it's saying is that when you add up all the things that men are good at and all the things that women are good at, you see no evidence for an overall advantage for men that's going to put more men at the top of the fields of math and science and other fields if discrimination and other social factors did not exist. So the argument there is no differences, and I stand by that argument. On the issue of intrinsic motives, I think we're not in a position to know at this point whether the different things that men and women often statistically, as Steve was saying, say they want, are stemming wholly from social forces or in part from biological forces. I don't think we can know that now. But what I want to do with my 30 minutes is start with the issue that's clearly the biggest source of debate between Steve and me. This issue of differences in intrinsic aptitude, do they exist or not, and what are they? There's another reason for me to do that. This is the only force among everything on this list that my own work and kind of professional knowledge has any bearing on whatsoever. Then I want to turn to the social forces as a layperson, as it were, on the outside looking at them, because I do think that they are exerting the biggest effects here, and say something about them. And then finally, if I haven't run hopelessly over time, I'll come back to this question of motives, and I imagine we'll both come back to it when we get to our discussion. Now, over the last 2-3 months, whatever it's been, there have been three kinds of arguments advanced in defense of the idea that men have greater aptitude, cognitive aptitude for science than women. The first argument is that from birth there's a difference in interest, and Steve actually brought this up a number of times. Boys are predisposed to be interested in objects and the mechanical world. Girls are predisposed to be interested in people and emotions. And this predisposition to figure out the mechanics of the world sets boys on a path that makes them more likely to become scientists or mathematicians. The second argument is that, as Galileo told us, the pursuit of science is conducted in the language of mathematics. Mathematics is the key ingredient to science. And the second claim is that males are intrinsically better at mathematical reasoning. They've got better mathematical abilities, and a subclaim to this, which Steve appealed to, better at spatial reasoning. And the third claim, which Steve also appealed to, that men show greater variability than women, and as a result, there are more men at the extreme upper end of the ability distribution from which our scientists and mathematicians are going to come. Let me take these claims one by one. So the first claim, as Steve said, has gained new currency recently from the work of Simon Baron-Cohen. It's actually a very old idea, but here's some of the new language in which Baron-Cohen puts it. He says that males are innately predisposed to learn about objects and mechanical relationships, and this sets them on a path toward becoming what he calls systematizers. Females, on the other hand, are innately predisposed to learn about people and their expressions of emotion, and this puts them on a path of development toward becoming what he calls empathizers. Now, if systematizing is at the heart of math and science, this leads to the conclusion that boys from this initial predisposition are more apt to develop the knowledge and skills that will lead to math and science. Now, to anyone who's as old as I am and have been following the literature on sex differences for long enough, this may seem like a surprising claim. The classic reference on the nature and development of sex differences is the book of Eleanor Maccabee and Carol Jacklin that came out in the early to mid-'70s, where they reviewed a huge literature on all different kinds of aspects of sex differences. They provided evidence for all sorts of reliable sex differences, looking across large numbers of studies. But they also came to the conclusion that certain ideas about differences between the genders were a myth. And at the very top of their list of mythical ideas was this idea that males are primarily interested in objects and females are primarily interested in people. They went through an enormous old literature where you stuck babies down in front of objects and people, and you saw were they more interested in one or the other, where you looked at kids in playgrounds, and their conclusion was there was no such difference. On the other hand, this conclusion was made in the early 70s, and at that time, although people had done a fair amount of work sticking babies in front of objects and people, we didn't actually know very much about what babies understand about objects or people, or how their understanding grows, how it changes, what kinds of things babies are learning about. And since Baron Cohen's claims are really claims about differential predispositions to learn different kinds of things, you could argue that they really hadn't been tested in Maccabee and Jacqueline's time. So we can ask 30 years later, what does this research show? Well, I'm going to take you on a whirlwind tour of 30 years of research in one PowerPoint slide. It goes roughly like this. From birth, babies can see objects. They know where one object ends and the next one begins. Their vision is horrendously bad. They can't see objects as well as you can, even as well as I can. But as they're growing, their object perception becomes richer, more differentiated. It improves a lot over infancy, but they started out already with some rudimentary abilities. Babies also start out with rudimentary abilities to represent that an object continues to exist when it's out of view and to hold on to those representations, though they get much better at holding on to them for longer and over more complicated kinds of changes as they grow. Babies also make basic inferences about object motions, things like inferences like what do you have to do to an object to set it in motion? You have to hit it. The force with which you hit it determines the force with which it moves, and so forth. These inferences undergo these patterns of inferences undergo regular developmental change over the infancy period, but even very early on, they're starting to reason about objects in motion. Now, in each of these cases, there are systematic developmental changes. They've been traced in some cases to maturational changes, in other cases specifically to learning, and there's variability. And because there's variability, we can ask, what happens when we compare the abilities of male infants to the abilities of females? Do we see sex differences? And the work gives a clear answer to that question. We don't. Male and female infants are equally interested in objects. Male and female infants make the same inferences about object motion at the same time in development. They learn the same things about object mechanics at the same time. If you look across very large numbers of studies, you'll occasionally find a study that favors one sex over the other, actually more often girls, who might learn that the force with which you hit something influences the force at which it moves a month earlier than boys do. But these differences are small and scattered, and for the most part, what you see is very high convergence across these studies. And these common paths of learning continue through the preschool years as kids start manipulating objects, figuring out, can I get this rectangular block into this circular hole? If you look at differences in rates at which boys and girls figure these things out, you don't find any differences. So we see equal developmental paths there. And I think this supports a conclusion that's actually really important. In all of this discussion of sex differences, I think we need to spend a little time asking what's common across the two sexes. One thing that's common is we don't divide up the labor of understanding the world as infants, with males focusing on the mechanical world and females focusing on people and emotions. Males and females are both interested, both in objects and in emotions. They're learning about both of them. They're not dividing that cognitive labor. The conclusions that Maccabee and Jacqueline drew in the early 1970s have been very well supported by research since that time. Let me turn to the second claim, that it's all very well and good that we've got equal abilities to develop intuitive understanding of the physical world, but formal math and science isn't really about building on your intuitions. It's about using mathematics to come up with new characterizations of the world and new principles to understand its functioning. So maybe males have an edge in scientific and mathematical reasoning because there's an intrinsic difference in the male talent for mathematics. Now, as Steve said, formal mathematics is not something we could have evolved the ability to do. It's a very recent accomplishment. All those animals out there showing sex differences in aggression and so forth, they're not doing formal math, they're not doing formal science. Neither are humans back in the Pleistocene. These are rather recent developments. And what that means is that if we have a biological basis for our mathematical reasoning abilities, it must be because we're endowed with biological systems that evolved for other purposes, but that we've been able to harness for the new purpose of representing and manipulating numbers, geometry, spatial relationships, and so forth. Now, a lot of research from intersecting fields of cognitive neuroscience, neuropsychology, cognitive psychology, and cognitive development provide evidence for 5 what I would call core systems at the foundations of mathematical reasoning. The first is a system for representing small exact numbers of objects, the difference between 1 and 2 and 3. And this is a system that emerges and is functional in human infants about as early as 5 months of age, continues to be present in adults. The second is a system for discriminating large approximate numerical magnitudes, the difference between a set of about 10 things and a set of about 20 things. That also emerges early in infancy, 4 or 5 months, and continues to be present and functional and used by us as adults. The third is the system that's probably the first serious, uniquely human foundation for numerical abilities, the system of natural number concepts that we construct as children when we learn verbal counting. And that construction takes place between about the ages of 2.5 and 4 years of age. And the last 2 systems are systems that we first see children using when they navigate. One is a system for representing the geometry of the surrounding layout that you can use to find objects that are hidden in particular locations with respect to the shape of a room. The other is a system for representing landmark objects, which children will use to locate objects when they're hidden directly in environments. Now, all of these abilities have been studied quite extensively in large numbers of male and female infants, and so we can ask in each case, are there sex differences in the development of any of these systems at the foundations of mathematical thinking? And again, the answer is no. I want to show you data from just 2 cases, which I think, from Steve's review of the differences among adults, might seem like the most relevant cases. So the first is the development of natural number concepts. Now, I told you these are constructed by children between about the ages of 2.5 and 4. If you look at kids, though, at any particular time slice of development, you'll find a lot of variability. So, for example, between the ages of 3 and 3.5, you'll find some children who have only figured out the meaning of the word one and can only have some symbolic understanding of the concept one versus all other numbers. But at that same age, you'll find other kids who figured out the meanings of all the words in the count list up to 10 or 20 or more and can use all of them in a meaningful way. And most of the kids will be somewhere in between. They will have figured out the first 2 symbols or the first 3 and so forth. But when you now break children's performance down by sex, you see no hint of a difference between the 2 sexes, no hint of a superiority of males in constructing natural number concepts. The other example I want to show you comes from these studies that are, I think, the closest thing in a preschool child to the mental rotation tasks that Steve described that are conducted with adults. In these studies, a child's put in a room of a given shape, something's hidden in a corner, and then their eyes are closed and they're spun around. So what they have to do is remember the shape of the room, open their eyes, retrieve that memory of the shape of the room, and now figure out from the new direction in which they're facing how they have to rotate themselves to get back to the object where it was hidden before. Now, if you test a group of 4-year-olds, you find they're able to do this task well above chance. Most of them are not perfect. You get a range of performance, and when you break that performance down by gender, again, not a hint of an advantage for boys over girls. So these findings and others seem to me to support some important points. The first point is that indeed there is a biological foundation to mathematical and scientific reasoning. We're endowed with core knowledge systems that emerge prior to any formal instruction in young children and that serve as a basis for mathematical thinking. But these systems seem to develop equally in males and females. Now, about 10 years ago, Steve's already referred to the evolutionary psychologist and sex difference researcher David Gary. He reviewed the literature that was available at that time and concluded on that basis that there were no differences in what he calls primary abilities, what I call core systems underlying mathematics. And I think what we've learned in the last 10 years or so continues to support that conclusion. Now, sex differences do emerge at older ages. Remember, the debate is not, are there sex differences? The debate is, do they add up to an advantage for one sex over the other? So sex differences do emerge later in childhood. As Steve said, because they emerge late, it's very hard to tease apart their biological and social sources. But before we attempt that task, let's ask what the differences are. I think the following is a fair statement, both of some of the differences that Steve described and of some others. When people are presented with a complex task that can be solved through multiple different strategies, males and females will sometimes differ in the strategy that they prefer. For example, if I give you a task that can only be solved by representing the geometry of the layout, we will not see a difference between men and women. But if I give you a task that could be accomplished either by representing geometry or by representing individual landmarks, we may see a sex difference, where girls will be more likely to rely on the landmarks, girls are women, and men more likely to rely on the geometry. To take another task, that mental rotation task that Steve told you about. When you have to compare the shapes of two objects at different orientations, there's two different strategies you can use to do that. You can attempt a holistic rotation in your mind of one of the objects into registration with the other, or you can do point-by-point featural comparisons of the two. Men are more likely to do the first, women are somewhat more likely to do the second. Finally, in those mathematical word problems that figure so strongly on the SATM, the test that Steve's already been talking about, very often they allow multiple solutions. And both item analyses and studies of high school students engaged in the act of solving those problems, taking model SAT tasks, suggest that when you've got the choice of solving a problem by plugging in a formula or by doing Venn diagram-like spatial reasoning, relatively more girls will tend to do the first and relatively more boys will tend to do the second. Now, because of these differences, males and females will sometimes show differing cognitive profiles on timed tasks where what's crucial is you got to solve something fast, and some strategies are going to be faster than others. So in particular, as Steve said, females will be better at some verbal, mathematical, and spatial tasks, and males will be better at other verbal, mathematical, and spatial tasks. Now notice, this pattern of different profiles is not well captured by the generalization that's often bandied about in the popular press, that women are verbal and men are spatial. There doesn't seem to be any more evidence for that than there was for the, as McAfee and Jacqueline said, for the idea, women are social and men are object-oriented. Rather, the differences are more subtle. But still, it's a fair question. It's an empirical question. For all the certainty of the quotes that you put up on mine, I'm completely committed that this is an empirical question. Does one of these two profiles foster better learning of math than the other? And in particular, is this male profile a better one to have if you're going to engage in high-level mathematical reasoning? Well, at this point, we have to ask ourselves a question that's been much discussed in the literature on mathematics education and mathematical testing. Many publications from the Educational Testing Service on this, and a whole new book that just came out that's devoted to this question. The question is, by what yardstick can we decide whether a male profile or a female profile, whether a group of men or a group of women are better at math? Now, some people, Steve seemed to be doing this, suggest that we look at how people perform on the SATM, the quantitative part of the Scholastic Assessment Test. But as people have often argued, there's a problem of circularity with that decision. Here's the problem. If you look at the SAT test, it's composed of a whole bunch of different types of items. Now, some of those items are solved better by females. Some of those items are solved better by males. So the people who make the test now have a problem that they have to solve. How many of each type of item should they be putting in that test? Depending on how they answer that problem, they will create a test that makes women look like great mathematicians or a test that makes men look like great mathematicians. What's the right solution? Well, as I said, there are books that are devoted to this question, much debate, but there seems to be a consensus about the following point. The only way to come up with a test that's fair is to develop an independent understanding of what mathematical aptitude is and how it's distributed between men and women. But if that's true, then we can't use performance on the current or some other version of the SAT to give us that understanding. We've got to get that understanding in some other way. So how are we going to get it? Well, another possibility, and Steve showed data on this, is to look at job outcomes. Maybe the people who are better at mathematics are the people who go into more mathematically intensive jobs. But here, there's actually two problems. The first problem is how you answer if you base your answer as to who's more mathematically talented on which jobs they go into, the answer you get is going to depend on which mathematically intensive jobs you use. If you choose engineering as your example of a mathematically intensive job, you will conclude, or actually any of the ones Steve had on the board, you will conclude that men are better at math because there's more men who become engineers. If you use accounting as your example of a math-intensive job, you will say that women are better at math because, believe it or not, there are more women accountants out there working today in that highly social, people-oriented field. More women accountants. 57% current accountants are women. So which job are we going to pick to decide where's the real mathematical talent? I think that what these two examples suggest, though, is a deeper problem with using job outcomes as our measure of mathematical talent. Surely you've got to be good at math to go into a mathematically intensive job. But talent at mathematics is not sufficient to account for job selection. It's one of the forces at work, but there's going to be many other forces at work too. It can't be our gold standards for mathematical ability. So what can be? I would like to suggest that the following is the ideal experiment to conduct. What we want to do is we want to take a large number of male students and a large number of female students who have equal educational background, and we want to present them with the kinds of tasks that real mathematicians face. We want to give them new mathematical material that they have not yet mastered. We want to allow them to learn it over an extended period of time, the kinds of time scales that real mathematicians work on, and we want to ask, how well do they master this material? Now, the good news is this experiment is done all the time. It's called high school and college. Here's the way it comes out. In high school, girls now take about half of the math classes, including the most advanced ones, and they get better grades. In college, women earn almost half of the bachelor's degrees in mathematics. Another statistic that surprised me as I started getting into this. And men and women get equal grades. And I have to respectfully disagree with one thing that Steve said. Men and women get equal grades even when you equate for the institutions, you only compare people within a single institution, within a single math class. So you're comparing two people both taking the engineering version of calculus or differential geometry. Equating for classes and grades, they're getting equal grades across these institutions. Now, I think the outcome of this large-scale experiment gives us every reason to conclude that men and women have equal talent for mathematics. And here I'd also like to quote Diane Halpern. Yes, Diane Halpern reviews much evidence for sex differences, but her conclusion is differences are not deficiencies. Men and women have equal talent overall. They're equally intelligent, as Steve said. And in an article in this book in 2005, she concludes they have equal aptitude for mathematics. So I think that's the evidence clearly, I think, is on that side of saying, yes, there are these differences, but they don't add up to an overall advantage for one sex over the other. But let me turn to the third claim, that men show greater variability, perhaps in general, perhaps just in quantitative abilities in particular, and so there's more of them at the upper end of the ability distribution. I can probably go quickly here because Steve has already told you about the work of Camilla Benbow and Julian Stanley, the study of mathematically precocious youth, focusing on these kids who are screened at age 13 and then put in intensive accelerated programs and then followed up afterwards to see what they're able to achieve in mathematics. Now, as Steve said, when they were screened at age 13 by the same SAT test, there were many more boys than girls who scored at the very highest levels. And in those days, it was almost 13-1 over 12-1. As Steve said, the disparities are now substantially lower, but there's still a disparity of boys among the very small subset of people from this large talented sample who score at the very upper end. Now, based on those data, Benbow and Stanley concluded that there are more boys than girls in the pool from which future mathematicians will be drawn. But notice, there's a problem with this conclusion. It's based entirely on the SAT-M, okay? This test that's in need of an explanation, that's in need of a foundation, a more firm yardstick for asking what the differences are. Now, fortunately, as Steve said, the Benbow and Stanley and then Lubinsky group has collected much more data on these mathematically talented boys and girls. And now we're talking not just about the ones who scored at the extreme end on this one-timed test, but rather this full sample, much larger sample, including many girls as well as boys who were accelerated and followed over time. Let's look at some of the key things that they found. First of all, they looked at college performance by the talented sample. They found that these youths, once they got to college, took equally demanding math classes, and they majored in math in equal numbers. When you go to physics and engineering versus biology, you see more of the girls majored in biology, more of the boys in physics, as Steve was saying. But in actual mathematics itself, there were equal numbers of girls and boys majoring in math, and they got equal grades. I think this suggests that the SAT is not only underpredicting the performance of college women in general, who are getting equal grades for doing less well on the SAT, it's also underpredicting the college performance of the talented sample at the extreme upper end. By the most meaningful measures we have, ability to assimilate new, challenging material in demanding mathematics classes in top-flight institutions where you're majoring in mathematics. By that measure, they're not finding any difference between girls and boys. So, what's causing the gender imbalance on these faculties of math and science? Well, I'm arguing it's not that. Let's turn to the other factors that I think are much more important. And here, because I'm really out of my own area of work, and also because time is short, I'm not going to give you a review of all of the social factors that are producing differential success of men and women. In fact, I want to talk about exactly one. I want to talk about how gender stereotypes influence the ways in which males and females are perceived. Now, let's start with studies of parents' perceptions of their own children. Steve said that parents report, and huge meta-analyses support this, parents report they treat their children equally. They treat their boys the same way they treat their girls. They encourage them to equal extents. They are gender neutral in their treatment of their kids. They want both their sons and their daughters to succeed. No doubt true. But how are they seeing their kids? Well, some studies have taken babies just at the moment of their birth, just at the point where the question that's 80% of the time, the first question that a new parent asks about the baby, is it a boy or a girl, has been answered. They've just got this new baby, and they're asked to describe the baby. And parents of boys describe their babies as stronger, hardier, and bigger than parents of girls. Now, the people who did the study also took a look at the medical records and asked, what does the baby weigh? What's the muscle tone like? What are the APGAR scores? Are there really any differences between the boys and girls? By those measures, they found the boys and girls were indistinguishable, but the parents' descriptions were different. At 12 months of age, girls and boys show pretty much equal abilities or inabilities to locomote around, crawling up and down slopes, crawling up and down stairs, driving their parents crazy, and so forth. They're about equal in ability. But in one study conducted in the lab of Karen Adolph, who's done lots of studies of children's locomotor development, she wanted to look at how kids would behave, whether they'd be able to crawl down a sloping ramp. And before she actually had the kids crawl, she asked the parents, how well do you think your child's going to do? You think your child will be able to make it down this ramp? And now, there was a big difference depending on the sex of the child. People with sons were much more confident that that kid was going to make it down the ramp than parents of daughters. When they actually set the kid loose and had them go down the ramp, there was no difference whatever between the sons and the daughters. But there was a difference in the parents' predictions. 30 Third example, moving up in age, Steve has talked about the studies of Jackie Eccles. She has asked parents of boys and girls in 6th grade, how talented do you think your child is at mathematics? And she found a sex difference where parents of sons were more likely to say they thought their son had a talent for math than parents of daughters. When she actually did a panoply of objective measures, she asked, what are the kids' grades in school? What are the kids' performance on standardized tests? What do teachers say? As Steve said, teachers are actually more accurate here. What do teachers say about this child's ease of learning new material? And when she asked the children, how much do you like math? Okay? She found no differences between the girls and boys, but there was a difference in parents' perception of. There was also no difference, by the way, in parents' report of how well their child was doing in school. But their perception of that intangible talent, that was different between the boys and the girls. And other studies have shown a similar thing for science. Now, here we have to ask, there's clearly a mismatch between what parents are seeing in their kids and what objective tests and other measures seem to be revealing. But we have to ask, is it possible that the parents are seeing something that the objective measures are missing? Maybe that clueless boy getting B's in his math class really is a mathematical genius inside, and his mom or dad has seen that. That's a possibility. What we really want is studies in which we present observers with the very same baby or child or PhD candidate, and we simply manipulate their belief about whether that person is male or female, and we ask whether that influences their perception. Now, it's hard to do those studies, but there are examples, and I want to give you a few of them. There's a bunch of studies that take the following form. You show a group of parents or college undergraduates video clips of babies that they don't know personally, and for half of them, you give the baby a male name, and for the other half, you give the baby a female name. By the way, if there are clothes on, this is an easy study to run. They don't look real different at these early ages. You have the observers watch the baby for a while, and then you ask them a series of questions. What do you think this baby's doing? What do you think the baby's feeling? How would you rate this baby on a dimension like strong to weak, or more intelligent to less intelligent, and so forth? And what you find is, I think, two important things. The first thing, this is really important. I don't want to exaggerate the effects of these studies. When the babies do something unambiguous, the parents' reports are not affected by their gender. If the baby clearly smiles, everybody says they're smiling. Everybody says they're happy, okay? It's not the case that perception of children is pure hallucination. But what is the case? What is the case is very often children do things that aren't unambiguous, and very often parents are trying to answer questions where the answers aren't easily readable off the child's overt behavior. And in those cases, you see some interesting differences. So, for example, in one study, a child on a video clip was playing with a jack-in-the-box, and it suddenly popped up. And the child was clearly very startled by that and jumped back with some kind of negative reaction. And when people were asked, what's the child feeling? Those who were given a female label said, that child's afraid. The ones given a male label said, he's angry. Okay, same child, same reaction, different interpretation. Other examples, children with male names are more likely to be rated as strong, intelligent, and active. Those with female names are more likely to be rated as little, soft, and so forth. Now, I think these perceptions matter. Notice, you may be as a parent, completely committed to treating your male and female children equally. But no sane parent would treat a fearful child the same way they treat an angry child. If your knowledge of a child's gender affects your perception of what that child is doing, then your male and female children are going to be growing up getting different reactions from the world, different patterns of responses, different patterns of encouragement. Okay, I think these perceptions really matter, and they're going to matter even in parents committed to treating sons and daughters alike. Well, I want to give you one last version of a gender labeling study. This one hits particularly close to home. The subjects in this study were people like Steve and me. They were practicing academic professors of psychology, and they were sent some vitas to evaluate. Now, there were two different vitas that were used in this study. One of them was a vita of a walk-on-water candidate, best candidate you've ever seen. You would die to have this person on your faculty. They were described, by the way, in this first study as applicants for a job. The other vita was a middling, average vita for among successful people. And randomly, for half the people, the name on the Vita was male. For the other half, the name was female. And people were asked a series of questions. They were asked, what do you think about this person's research productivity? What do you think about their teaching experience? And finally, would you hire them if they applied for a job at your university? Now, first thing to say again, and again this says that we're not dealing with hallucinations here. For the walk-on-water candidate, there was no effect of gender labeling, okay? When somebody great comes along, I think this actually really supports the view that Steve was saying, that we're not dealing with overt discrimination on universities. It's not as if you see a female name on a Vita and you think, yuck, I don't want anything to do with that. That's not what's happening, okay? When the Vita's great, everybody says, great, let's hire, okay? What about that average Vita, though? That is to say, the kind of Vita we most, on average, will see applying for jobs. Now, in that case, there were some differences. The male name was rated as having higher research productivity, okay? These psychologists, Steve's and my colleagues, looked at the same number of publications and thought, good productivity when the name was male. When the name was female, not so good, okay? Less good productivity. Same thing for teaching experience. The very same number of courses taught was seen as good teaching experience when the name was male, and less good teaching experience when the name was female. And in answer to the question, would you hire, 70% said yes for the male, 45% for the female. If the decision were made by majority rule, that male's going to get hired and female is not. A couple other interesting things that came out of this study. These effects were every bit as strong among the respondents who were female as among the respondents who were male. It is not the case that men are the culprits in this kind of phenomenon. And their effects at the tenure level as well. At the tenure level, the effects were a little different. They used a very strong candidate. Everybody said this looks like a good case for tenure. But people were invited to say, do you have any reservations? And people came up with some very reasonable reservations. They would say, this person looks very strong, but before I agree to give this person tenure, I would need to know, was this her own work or was it the work of her advisor? Now that's a perfectly reasonable question to ask. But what ought to give us pause is that those kinds of questions were asked 4 times more often when the name was female than when the name was male. So there's this pervasive, I think, difference in perceptions. I think the differences matter. Of course, scientists' perceptions of the quality of a candidate are going to influence everything from the likelihood that that candidate will get a fellowship, to get a job, to get resources in a job, to get promoted. And above all, I think what these studies are saying is that this pattern of unequal evaluation is going to take place even among people who are absolutely committed to gender equality. I have little or no doubt that all of my colleagues here at Harvard are completely committed to the idea that if they're faced with a male candidate and a female candidate of equal qualifications, those 2 candidates should have equal chance at a job. But everybody also thinks if you've got a more productive person that you're comparing to a less productive, a more experienced to a less experienced, a more independent to a less independent, of course those factors all matter as well. Well, what these studies say is that your knowledge of a person's gender will influence your assessment of those variables, and that's going to produce a pattern of discrimination. So I think the general thing that comes through from these studies is that from the moment of birth to the moment of tenure, throughout this great development of profession, we're seeing unintentional but pervasive and important differences in the ways that males and females are perceived and therefore evaluated. Now, I have to emphasize, perceptions are not everything. For one thing, as I showed you, when cases are unambiguous, you don't see these effects. For another thing, I think the most interesting conclusion to emerge, if you put together the first set of evidence I told you about the equal capacities and achievements of boys and girls in educational settings, including in science and mathematics, with this very different ways in which boys and girls are perceived and evaluated, what comes through to me is how robust cognitive development is. I think it's really great news that despite the differences in perception, you see males and females developing along common paths and developing common sets of abilities. I think that's strong reason to think that mathematical and scientific reasoning do have a biological basis. It's just that it's a biological basis that's shared by males and females. The second way in which perceptions aren't everything is I want to grant at the outset. Remember, the question here is not, are there differences between the sexes? You are not going to create someone who feels like a girl simply by perceiving them that way. And I think that's the lesson that comes from those studies of the people who started out being raised in one sex and changed to another. There really are biological sex differences. They are real, they're important, they're not cultural constructions, they're not something we impose on people. They really exist. But the question on the table here is not, are there biological sex differences? The question to remind you is, why are there fewer women mathematicians and scientists? And it seems to me that we can, that the patterns of discrimination I described can give us 4 interconnected answers to that question. First of all, and most obviously, biased perceptions are going to produce a situation where when a group of equally qualified men and women are evaluated for jobs, more of the men are going to get those jobs. Second, they're going to create a situation in which, among people considering whether to stand for a job, if people are rational, more men than women are going to put themselves forward into the academic competition because they will rationally see that they've got a better chance of success. It will just be objectively true that men will face better odds, they'll get more resources, and so forth. And if people perceive this, that's going to lead more men to want to go into these fields. What's more, biased perceptions earlier in life may well deter some younger students, female students, from even attempting a career in science and mathematics. If your parents are feeling that you don't have as much natural talent as someone else whose objective ability is maybe better than yours, but they're seen as more talented, that may be discouraging to people, and some of Jackie Eccles' work supports that view. And finally, there's going to be a snowball effect. All of us have an easier time imagining ourselves in careers where there are other people who are like us. Insofar as these first 3 effects perpetuate a situation where there are few female scientists and mathematicians, it's going to be less likely that young girls will see that as a life for them. So my personal scorecard sees these as the major factors. Let me just end, though. I want to turn this over to the discussion by raising the question, could it also be the case that Steve's partly right? Could it be that biological differences in motives, motivational patterns that evolved in the Pleistocene, but that apply to us today, and that push more men than women towards careers in math and science? My feeling is that where we stand now, we have no possibility of evaluating that claim. It's conceivable that it's true, it's an empirical claim, but as long as the forces of discrimination and misperceptions are affecting people so pervasively, we'll never know whether that claim is right. I think the only way we can know it is to do one more grand experiment. That's to allow all of the evidence that really the abilities of men and women add up to equal cognitive capacity. Let that evidence permeate through the society. Let people then start looking at kids and evaluating them in relation to their actual capacities, as opposed to in relation to one's sense of what their capacities ought to be given their gender. And then see, as those boys and girls grow up, are they hearing different inner voices pulling in different ways? I don't know what the answer to that question is going to be, but I sure hope that we get to raise some future generation of kids that will find out.
So we're a little bit behind. We're now going to turn to the 2 participants and ask them to respond to each other's comments somewhat briefly so we can eventually hear from the audience. Steve?
Yes. Thanks, Liz, for a very stimulating and apposite presentation. I have a number of comments. One of them is that I don't dispute a lot of the points that you made, but many of them have lost sight of the datum that we're here to explain in the first place. Basic abilities like knowing that an object is still there when you put a hanky over it, or knowing that one object won't pass through another, are not the kinds of things that distinguish someone who's going to be a physics professor at math from someone who isn't. And a number of the cases in which you correctly said that there's no gender difference in kids, there isn't a gender difference in adults either, such as the give a number task and other basic core abilities. Also, one big concern with all of the null effects that you mentioned is the question of statistical power. And Bob Rosenthal, 20 years ago, pointed out that the vast majority of studies that psychologists do are incapable of detecting the kinds of results that they seek, which is why it's so important to have meta-analyses and large sample sizes. Would like to question whether all of the null results that you mentioned can really be justified in terms of being even comparable to the studies done on older kids and adults. One place where I really do disagree with you is about the value of the SAT-M, where the circle, I think, has amply been broken. This is what the people at the College Board are obsessed with. And what they have shown is, regardless of the what you are treating as the gold standard, namely performance in college courses, what this datum is that we're disputing is not how well boys and girls do in school or how well men and women do in college, because there we agree that there's no male advantage. On the other hand, for the thing that we really are discussing, namely performance at the upper levels, getting tenure-track jobs, getting patents, and so on, the analyses have shown that the SAT is not biased against girls, namely a given increment in your SAT score predicts a given increment in the important variable to the same extent whether you're male or female. And it's moreover not true that I think there's a slight difference in the finding that both of us were alluding to. In terms of the difference in grades, it's not that girls' grades come about, better grades come about because they take easier courses. They don't. They really do get better grades holding courses constant. Rather, it's that the underprediction of the SAT can be explained by the combination of conscientiousness and
the most
choice.
recent thing I've read about this that contradicts that. It's the Gallagher and Kaufman book, Sex Differences in Mathematics, which just came out about a month ago. The numbers that they report is that equating for classes and institutions and looking just at A students, there's a 21-point SAT math differential. That is to say, for two students getting the same grade of A, the average for the girls, the SAT will have been 21 points lower. And that differential is there at every grade level, and it's there in all the courses. And the SAT, people have discussed it as a problem. One of the discussions reached the conclusion that the SAT was still useful because although it was under-predicting girls' performance in college, girls' grades was over-predicting their performance in college. And if you used the two together, you would be okay. And in fact, they ended up advising that people never take account of the SAT simply by itself. Consider it in relation to kids' grades, which I think, as you were talking earlier about with GREs and us admitting people to grad school, that's in fact what colleges do and what graduate programs do. Interestingly, though, in all of the public discussion of the relative advantages or disadvantages of men versus women for math and science that's taken place over the last 2 months, people have not used the SAT in conjunction with grades to talk about relative ability. They've used the SAT by itself, and I think that's led to a really distorted conversation here about this issue.
Okay, but it nonetheless remains the fact that it remains true that in the most recent study by Lubinsky and Benbow, looking at the fantastic predictive power of giving an SAT even in 7th grade, there was no difference in predictive power of in boys and girls in any of these measures. But let me turn to another one.
Go ahead.
Phil, again, going back to the datum that is at issue here, which is the differential representation of the sexes in physical sciences, mechanical engineering, and mathematics. The fact that men and women are equal overall in spatial abilities and in mathematical abilities is a little bit irrelevant to this. So it may be that the particular talents in which women excel make them more likely to go into accounting, but again, the datum is not a gender difference in accounting. The datum is a gender difference in the physical sciences, engineering, and mathematics. And I think if you look at the range of professions, the size of the sex discrepancy is predicted by how much spatial cognition and how much abstract mathematical reasoning each of those jobs requires. In terms of the effects of parents' expectations, I think there was a sense starting in the 1970s that the model for development is that as the twig is bent, so grows the branch. That very subtle differences in parents' perceptions early in life can have a lasting effect. You aim the child in a particular direction and you'll see the effect years later. I think now there's an enormous amount of research spearheaded by the behavioral genetics revolution that is not true, that there are effects of parenting, parental expectations, parental treatment on young children when they're in the home, and that in every study, short of outright abuse or neglect, those effects peter out. The studies of adoption and twins and sibs reared apart show that those differences the differences that occur in parenting are a function of pre-existing differences in the children. Any additional effect of parenting peters out to nothing.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
I think that one thing that's different about the gender case than about the early socialization case for other kinds of qualities, different styles of parenting and so forth, is that the differences that we see reflected in parents' differing perceptions are mirrored in differing perceptions that males and females experience throughout their lives. It's not the case that you would just look at one idiosyncratic pair of parents who were treating kids in one way, but then as soon as they left that environment, other people are going to be treating them differently. Rather, I think what we have in the case of gender is such a pervasive pattern that, I'm rather a nativist about cognition, and I would be tempted to look at that pattern and think, maybe Darwin gave us some bizarrely, innately wrong idea about the genders that just keeps getting perpetuated in different people as they're looking at them. I think that when we see that professionals in professional contexts are showing the same patterns of evaluation that parents are showing in home contexts. And when we think that children are going to be facing those patterns of evaluation, not just when they're young and at home, but continuing through high school and into college and finally with their colleagues on academic faculties, that we're dealing with a very much more pervasive kind of effect than the effects of socialization that other studies that you've written about and talked about are dealing with.
Mm-hmm. About bias, I don't, as I mentioned at the outset, I don't doubt that bias exists, although the idea that the bias started out by some arbitrary coin flip one way or another, and that they've only been perpetuated by the existence of bias, I think is one that's extremely unlikely. Both because in so many cases, as Eagly and the stereotype accuracy people point out, the biases are accurate, and also because, there's an irony in these discussion of people's biases, that when we test people in the cognitive psychology lab and we don't call these base rates gender, we applaud people when they apply them. If they apply the statistics of groups to an individual case, that's called accurate Bayesian reasoning, overcoming base rate neglect. Now, when people do it in the case of gender, we treat it as a cognitive flaw. Now, I think it is a moral flaw. Namely, I don't think that base rates ought to be applied in judging individuals, but the fact that they're applied does not mean that their origin was completely arbitrary. Indeed, their origin may be statistically sound in many cases.
Can I reply to that? Because I agree that the origin is not arbitrary, and I agree that there's a bias there for an objective reason, but I think you're drawing the wrong conclusion about it. I think the reason there's a bias to think that men have greater natural talent for math and for science is that when we look around the world and we ask, who's winning the Nobel Prizes? Who's making the great advances in science? What we see again and again and again is men. This year, for the first time, Linda Buck in physiology or medicine. But for the most part, it's overwhelmingly men who are achieving at the upper levels of math and science. And I think it's very natural to look at that and think there must be some reason, some inner difference between men and women, which is producing this enormous disparity. And I quite agree with you that good statistical reasoning would then lead you to think, okay, the next kid who comes along, if they're a man, they're more likely to join that group of Nobel Prize winners too. What I would like to suggest is that we have good reasons to resist this kind of conclusion. And the reasons aren't only moral, they're also logical. And let me just use an analogy, okay? Let's replay this debate over the biological bases of mathematics and science talent 150 years ago. Let's consider who the 19th century mathematicians and scientists were, okay? What we will find is that they were overwhelmingly male, just as they are today. But we'll also find that they were overwhelmingly European. You're not going to see an Asian face, you're not going to a Chinese face, you're not going to see an Indian face. It would be very tempting to apply this same pattern of statistical reasoning and say, there must be something about European genes that give greater mathematical talent than Asian genes do, okay? And if we go back still further and we play this debate back in the Renaissance, I think we should conclude that Catholic genes make for better science than Jewish genes, okay? Because all those Renaissance scientists, they were all Catholic, okay? I think if you look at those cases, you see what's wrong with this argument. What's wrong with the argument is not that biology is irrelevant. I don't think that if Galileo had been switched as a baby at birth with some other baby in Pisa from the ghetto and raised by Galileo's parents, that baby from the ghetto would have ended up teaching us that the language of physics is mathematics, okay? I think Galileo's genes had something to do with this. But so did Galileo's cultural, social environment, and his nurturing. Genius requires huge amounts of both. And my bet is that if in that baby switch Galileo had found himself growing up in the Pisan ghetto, he wouldn't have ended up being an example in this discussion today either. So yes, there are reasons for this statistical bias, but I think we want to step back for them and ask, why is it that all those Nobel Prize winners are men today? And consider the possibility that the answer to that question is the same reason why all the great scientists in Florence were Christian.
Yes, I think you could take the same phenomenon and make exactly the opposite argument, which is that if the phenomenon were really that there is a self-reinforcing, self-perpetuating dynamic to the fact that a difference originates perhaps for arbitrary reasons, people perceive the difference, they perpetuate it by their expectations, combined with the fact that, as you say, people don't go into fields in which the representation is not like their own group, then the dynamic that you'd expect is that the representation of different genders or ethnic groups should go to the extremes. Namely, you have a positive feedback loop where if you're in a minority, it will discourage people from entering the field, which will mean that there'll be even fewer, and on either side of a barrier, you should get a diffusion in opposite directions. The opposite model, I don't know if there are hard data that would verify it, but I suspect that the opposite model applies, namely that there certainly have been in many points in history arbitrary barriers against the entry of genders and races and ethnic groups to various professions. In many cases, as soon as the barrier is removed, far from the statistical underrepresentation perpetuating itself, as you predict, you get the floodgates opening and people reach some natural level. The Jackie Robinson effect in baseball. In the case of gender and science, remember what our datum is. It's not that women are underrepresented in professions or in sciences. In many professions, they are perfectly well represented. For example, being a veterinarian, majority women by a long shot. If you go back 50 or 100 years, there were no veterinarians who were women. That did not perpetuate itself via this positive feedback loop that you've alluded to.
I think I'm glad you brought up the case of the basketball and baseball players. I think it's interesting to ask, what distinguishes the cases where you remove the overt discrimination and within a very short period of time, the differential disappears, from the cases where you remove the overt discrimination and the covert discrimination continues and it doesn't disappear? What seems to me to be the case in the athletics kinds of cases where you see discrimination disappearing quickly is that there are clear objective measures of success. Whatever you think about the capacities of a black player, if they are hitting the ball out of the park, they're going to get credit for a home run, okay? That is not the case in science. In science, the judgments are subjective every step of the way. Who's the really talented person? Who deserves the bigger lab space? Who should get the next fellowship? Who should get promoted to tenure? These are not based on clear objective criteria. These are the cases where I think you see discrimination persisting. amazing. You see it in academia. You see it in Claudia Golden's studies of the orchestra auditions, where subtle judgments, who's the more emotive, sensitive player. If you know that they're male or female, you're going to be picking only men, but if they're behind a screen, you'll start picking more women. I think in these cases, you don't see things dropping away.
Break in here. I'm going to give you each 1 more minute to wrap up,
Okay.
And then we're going to go to the audience. So 1 minute each.
I'm not going to. I just want to respond to that. I don't think I'm going to wrap up everything else I said. But I think that makes the wrong prediction. The harder the science, the greater the participation of women. It's exactly the opposite. It's the most subjective fields, the social sciences, the humanities within academia, that have the greatest representation of women, which indeed follows exactly what the choices that women express in terms of what gives them satisfaction in life, but goes in exact opposite to the prediction that you made about the role of objective criteria. Surely it's physics compared to, say, sociology that has the more standard objective criteria for success.
Liz?
Well,
1 minute, or are you ready for the audience?
Well, let me just say one thing, because I didn't say much in the talk at all, about this issue of motives and there being biological differences in motives. Because I do think that that's been a less controversial one, but I think it's an important one, and most of your examples were concerned with that. I think it's a really interesting possibility that the forces that were active in our evolutionary past have led men and women to evolve somewhat differing concerns. I think that that's a real possibility. But I think that to jump from that possibility into the present and draw conclusions about what people's motives will be for pursuing one or another career is way too big a stretch. As we both agree, the kinds of careers that people are facing now, the kinds of choices they're making, are between options radically different from anything that anybody faced back in the Pleistocene. And it is anything but clear how motives that evolved then would be translated into a modern context. If I can just give one example of this. You've suggested as a hypothesis that because of sexual selection and also parental investment issues, that men will be selected to be more competitive and that women will be selected to be more nurturant. Well, if we want to translate from that to make predictions about desires for careers in math and science, we're going to have to answer a question that I think is really wide open right now. Suppose that that were true. What makes for better motives for a scientist? What kind of motives are more going to propel you to become a good scientist? Competitive motives, like the motives that J.D. Watson described in the double helix, out to get the structure of DNA before Linus Pauling does? Or nurturant motives of the kind that Doug Melton has been describing recently and talking about why he's going into stem cell research to find a cure for juvenile diabetes, which his children are suffering from. I think it's anything but clear how motives from our past are going to translate into modern contexts. And we would need to do these experiments of getting rid of discrimination and social pressures in order to find out.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to ask again that the questions be made very briefly. And we have some microphones to make sure people can be heard. Hands high so I can see you. Down here in the red shirt.
Can you hear it? I just had a quick question. How can you take achievement tests or, for example, the ability of men and women to learn a science and compare it to the ability of men and women to create science? Because after all, professors aren't good at learning what other people have done. They're good at doing stuff that people have never done.
That's a fair point. I think that's a criticism both of using basically any of the indicators that we see among students, either performance at, ability to learn new scientific material that's new for that student, though not new in the history of science, or the ability to give very rapid responses on short, standardized tests. I think that's a criticism of both. I mean, my own view is that the ability to learn new material in school is still closer to what a scientist does, but I take your point that real science is going beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, Lubinsky in a recent paper notes that the SAT administered at age 12 predicts what the mean number of patents that you've received, as well as having been enrolled in graduate school for 3 years. So it suggests, I mean, granted, very few people get patents, but that's certainly one kind of objective measure of creativity in these professions.
Hi. About the subjectivity issue that just came up. The issue is not the subjectivity of the scientists towards their work. The issue is the subjectivity of the perceiver. So as long as the people are fine with allowing women to excel or to be credible in the humanities or social sciences, which, by the way, I'm an artist by profession, and that's not even true all the way there, then there is no contradiction between what Professor Stolka said and the fact that there are more women in more subjectively perceived fields. I have a couple of comments about movement.
We're looking for a brief question.
Yeah, but this is really important because the spatial stuff does have to do with science and arts, and it's also true that women are often limited by social mores in feeling permitted to move around or express their sexuality freely, and I think all these might also inhibit them from feeling confident in the abstract thinking. Thank you.
Okay. Next question, over here. And then
I'm struck that no one has raised another question of what seems to me to be obvious unintentional discrimination, which is that when you have a field that has been dominated by men for the last 100, 200, forever, mathematics and science, that the defining of what makes you successful in that field will be designed to match male phenotype. So, for example, we all know that if you want to take off time to have a baby, you can't be a serious scientist or a mathematician. If you're not willing to put in 80 hours a week, you can't be a serious scientist or mathematician. But might that not, in fact, be something that's only true because a male-dominated academia has defined the rules that way, that it might turn out, if we allowed it to happen, we give men sabbaticals, give them a year off, so that they can enrich and grow and become better scientists. But if a woman takes a year off to have a baby, that impairs her growth as a scientist. So the question very simply is, doesn't it make sense that there almost necessarily has to be a built-in bias about motivation, because what motivates men to go into a field becomes the defining feature of what makes you successful in it?
I agree with part of that, and I think there are certain features of both the actual structure of academia that were set up when men laid out the rules. Certainly the upper-out and tenure policy is a glaring example. The ubiquity in hard sciences of weekend retreats and evening seminars is a second. The fact that in a number of fields, I think there's a certain fetishization of mathematical modeling, even when it's utterly sterile. I mean, I think in psychology, there's been an awful lot of mathematical psychology and probably some bias towards the people who tend to do it simply because it's men doing the judging. On the other hand, I think that only goes so far. I think it's just necessarily going to be true that anyone of either sex who works 80 hours is going to accomplish more than someone who works 40 hours. I think someone who takes a year off is not going to accomplish the same as someone who doesn't take a year off. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't put in mechanisms designed to redress these facts so that we don't do without the enormous talent of women scientists that is compromised by the fact that for the foreseeable future, women will have a greater role in child rearing. But I don't think that all of it is arbitrary, though I agree that some of it is self-serving mechanisms, that is.
I think there's two issues here that ought to be separated. One that you called attention to is an issue of timing of the lifetime career trajectory. If there's going to be one concentrated period of time when work is highest, has that been chosen at a time that's equally advantageous for men and women? And there it seems to me the answer is a clear no. But there's a second issue, which is there a difference between the sexes such that men are inherently more passionate about their work and want to do it longer, for longer hours than women do? I actually think that question is wide up in the air. I don't think we can know. My personal guess is that there's no such difference. Certainly if you look at UN statistics, something like 66 to 80% of the work of the world is done by women, not by men. If we look at average performance, it doesn't look as if it's the men who are really eager to go out and work all around the clock and the women who are taking time off and sitting on the beach. So that's one thing. But another, I think that actually maybe that's enough. I think that we would need most of the men who are working in academia. This idea that men are working 80 hours a week around the clock, I think, is also not true. There'll be intense periods of time before tenure. There'll be intense periods of time before grants. There's also a lot of time going to conferences and out to lunch and other things that go on. I think that the stereotype of the male working around the clock and the woman taking care of her babies is probably rather exaggerated.
Okay, here.
This was really interesting, and I just have a comment rather than a question. It seems that the snapshot of a situation as it is today, it's very important, of course. But however, it seemed to me that, like, if you just look a few centuries ago, women would burn as witches. For millions of women would just burn if they would express their opinion, or needless to say, probably they wouldn't study math. So this historical view gives us I think maybe a better explanation of that. It does take time for everyone to get better and to advance. And with this advancement in medicine today, as we have longer lives, I think there is still a chance for women and for all of us to not only have our kids but also have our career. And so I think it's time to be optimistic about that.
Thank you. Over here.
So, brief question. Both President Summers and Professor Spelke mentioned that social factors as being very important in these discrepancies, and it didn't figure prominently in Professor Pinker's description. I wanted to ask him whether the checklist that she put up at the beginning, which had a very small check next to social and a very big check next to some of the innate and motivational issues, is the way you see it, because both of you talked about some potential differences. Whether those differences make a big difference or not, I guess, seems to be the debate. I wanted to get your perspective on whether you see, not whether there are any differences exist or don't exist, but whether or not they really account for a significant share of what's going on in terms of the underrepresentation of women in science, math, and engineering.
Well, I wouldn't want to do that, multiple regression in my head. I think it is doable. I think that the fact that some of these differences are quite enormous, a standard deviation or more, is going to mean that in both interests, certain abilities, although I think interests are far more important than abilities, suggests it's very unlikely that all of it will be due to discrimination, especially since, again, getting back to the datum that we're trying to account for. I would say a significant proportion to all four. It would be my best guess. I mean, the best way I could do the regression in my head, but I think you'd really need better analysis to settle that.
Okay, last three questions. First here.
On the question of hours worked, I wanted to ask Professor Pinker why he would assume, as he apparently does, that 80 hours of work is equivalently good, is the equivalent of 2 times 40 hours of work. Or why the assumption might be that productivity in terms of numbers of papers is the same simply as an additive effect. When I worked as an editor at a leading peer-reviewed journal in a scientific field, the editors were often on the watch for what they called salami publication, which was the tendency among very prolific, extremely ambitious researchers to slice their work as narrowly as they could so as to publish as much of it as possible and thus extend the size of their CVs. It probably was very effective in gaining them certain rewards in their professions, but whether that is the same as scientific creativity and real long-term productiveness is open to doubt.
Well, there are two issues here. One of them is salami publication, and indeed there are data that men engage in that more often than women do, and that is something that ought to be taken into account in tenure evaluations and such. But in terms of number of hours put in, it just got to be the case that all things being equal, if you work 80 hours, you're going to do more than 40 hours. Not necessarily twice as much, but that's just a law of arithmetic. Unless the output is zero for a lot of those for all of those extra hours, or unless there's perfect compensation so that everyone who does less work is exactly more productive in terms of output per unit time. It's just the law of arithmetic.
Okay.
This question is for Dr. Spelke, and it brings us back to the issue that started the whole debate, which is why aren't there more women in science at Harvard? And it's motivated by the very striking data you report about discrimination on the basis of CVs, which shows clearly there is discrimination. However, the effect does not hold for the most stellar CVs, and I presume that Harvard is getting those in the sciences. So can you tell us what you think is going on?
Yes. I think that the finding that it didn't hold for the most stellar CVs was that when you send out, the subjects in this study came from a range of different universities. They weren't all at Harvard. So the most stellar CVs would have been off scale by the standards of most of the universities that the people who were in the study were in, okay? What I think the conclusion is the following, and I think it holds at Harvard as well as anywhere else, although I say this with the qualification that the data I gave you don't directly say this, but I think this is probably what's going on, that overt discrimination has really declined. When we see someone who is clearly a star, we're going to go for them, whether they're male or female. But no matter where you are, most decisions are not that easy. Most decisions, there's going to be multiple candidates, and we're not quite sure who the best one is, and we can see pros and cons in all different directions. And I think what these studies are telling us is that it's in those difficult cases that perceptions get colored in a way that leads us to overvalue the accomplishments of men and undervalue the accomplishments of women. And my guess is that that's occurring at institutions like Harvard every bit as much as it is in other places.
There is an interesting prediction there, and I don't know what the data are, but if the role of the priors or base rate or bias diminishes as the quality improves, you would expect there to be a greater gender imbalance in the lower quality institutions and less of one in the higher quality. And I don't know what the data are, but
Well, no, I mean, that's assuming that the relevant variable is quality as opposed to difficulty of decision, right? I mean, I think that if there's no overt discrimination, then easy decisions are going to be easy. And you're not going to see an effect of gender labeling on those decisions at any level. Right, it's going to be the hard ones where you're right on the edge where you'll see the difference.
But to the extent that the gender discrepancy comes from that labeling phenomenon, one would expect to see less gender discrimination and hence fewer gender disparities when all the CVs are at the top end compared to when most of them are in the middle.
Well, that's okay. So that's a
That's a prediction.
question. That's
yeah.
a prediction.
So
Okay.
there should be, yeah.
Last question.
This question is for Dr. Pinker. If I understood correctly, you do believe there is some degree, you acknowledge there is some bias. I wonder if you have formed an opinion about how that would be best mitigated.
Well, certainly making people aware of the possibility of bias would be important. In terms of overt attempts to measure it and nullify it via, say, aggressive affirmative action, I think all I'm going to say is I think there are costs and there are benefits, and that's something that I don't feel qualified to opine on in this format.
Let me thank all of you for joining us today, but in particular, let's thank the speakers who gave remarkable presentations.